A very beautiful community. Let's talk about Mr. Dugin in a way I didn't want to. Quite a few requests came in saying, please talk about Glenn Greenwald's interview in Russia with Mr. Dugin. And I thought, I'm not going to do this. And then I thought, it's actually of value having listened and also had the misfortune of making notes about it. It's not going to feed into our news cycle, the way some of our recent chats have done, but it's going to feed into the sort of big picture canvas against which our news cycle develops. At first I thought this was going to be quite Tucker Carlson-like, and therefore I thought we shouldn't talk about it because, Dugin could say something about how Russia needs to be a dictatorship, and Tucker could just say, amazing, fascinating. And of course, I'm familiar with Glenn Greenwald's work from years back, but I haven't followed him recently, so I wasn't sure how much we were going to get in terms of journalistic grit, which Glenn has had, and then also algorithmic drift, which is also something that Glenn has had. And there were enough real questions to provoke things in Dugin that impact us. There are really two ways to think about Dugin's usefulness, epistemically, in terms of sort of listening to his stuff. One, what you're seeing, the nuttiness you're seeing with the Trump administration every day, that's part of a global wash of authoritarianism that Dugin is feeding on and feeding into. And so when you want to understand that wash, somebody like Dugin, who's at the most malign end of that wash, intellectually, and at the least serious in a way too, it's worth looking at it because it's sort of an intensified presentation of what is on a smaller scale floating around all about us. Number one. Number two, Dugin is an ideologist of Putinism in reverse, and that's what makes him interesting. He is trying to stake out positions where he thinks the Putin regime will arrive. He is a preemptive follower of Putin's, which means he's not influential, doesn't lead anything, he doesn't have any kind of special access to Putin. But what he does have is a capacity to guess where the train is going and stand there before the train has got there. So, now before I talk about the interview, I had a very interesting experience. So this was my first time ever on Rumble. I'd never been on Rumble before. I downloaded the app. And of course, I don't have an account there, so I was bombarded with ads. And the ads were all the same. Throughout the interview, which is about 2 hours long, I got 8 ads, all from coffee from Russell Brand. So Russell jumped out of the screen at me and said, freedom straight into your... He said this 8 times, 8 Russell Brand ads. Freedom straight into your bowels. Coffee for 3 free thinkers. This coffee is a revolutionary act of defiance. Out of my bowels, straight into yours. Reclaim coffee from the workerati. Win a Tesla Cybertruck if you buy this coffee. Freedom straight from me into your mouth. 8 times I was interrupted by ads, anti-woke, pro-Tesla coffee ads from Russell Brand. Unbelievable. I cannot believe I survived it. And I had to watch it, I think, because you can't skip the ads. So fantastic. It was a good experience. But now to the interview. Dugin, immediately, in some months, you have arrived at the same conclusion that we arrived at many years ago. With Trump, you've arrived at a place where the masses may prefer a strong leader with extra capacity and special rights to change a situation that you consider to be in a pitiful condition. This is the same logic that we have, and maybe you understand us better now, because you have one of the first experiences of how great and beautiful some kind of democratic authoritarianism can be. There is an organic wash, and Dugin is speaking to it. And all you need to do here is just say, what are the ways in which Putinism and Trumpism are different? And they're very different. ideologically? What are the ways in which they're similar? And then you need to say, what are the ways we can't compare them simply because the conditions are different, right? Trump doesn't have the facility to do what Putin is doing in Russia. Now Glenn comes back. He says, but what about the argument that we are going to have an election in 2028, Mr. Dugin, and the midterms too? So Americans have the right to choose what you call democratic authoritarianism, but you don't have that choice in Russia. And Dugin says, we can choose someone considered by abstract principles as an authoritarian. A democracy can prefer a strong leader and a weak government. This has often happened, and liberals are afraid of it. Your elections should be an opportunity for voters to choose whoever they may want, rather than what the globalists tell them to want. This is a contradiction embedded in democracy itself. There can be genuine popular will to change the type of government. And so that absolutely gets right the fact that what we're seeing is democracy being used to undermine democracy in, Western countries where populist authoritarianism, post-truth populist authoritarianism is flourishing. Now, I think that there are two pillars here that Dugin can't overcome, and we'll see how he tries to overcome one of them when we think about democracy, that make our thinking about democracy immune from the kind of washout where you can't really separate it out from authoritarianism. The first is what we all know, institutions, right? Counter-majoritarian checks. One kind of power checking another kind of power, checking another kind of power, right? If you have 6 or 7 of these little, planets, you have a democracy until enough of them are knocked out. So you know this very well because we often talk about politicians as being institution breakers versus not institution breakers. And then there are also the folks in the middle like Marco Rubio, who are political entrepreneurs who don't want to be institution breakers, but will be if it serves their career. So that's very different to the sort of ideas about politics that Musk has, for instance. Musk is out to break institutions. Rubio isn't. Rubio is just breaking institutions because he's riding a train that's going to get him career benefits. But he doesn't really believe in breaking institutions. So these are political entrepreneurs, Rubio institution breakers, right? Like Vance and Musk. But then there is something else that's really important to democracy. And that is some kind of collective engagement and collective discourse. A capacity for the population to engage with itself about what its political system is and where it's going. And I want to say that necessarily requires free media and platforms where you can engage in an uncorrupted way. We're losing it in the West ourselves, right? Because we are controlled by algorithms in little bubbles that spur on distinct mental worlds and distinct fact worlds, something we've witnessed a sort of greater intensification of since the Trump election. Now, but at least we don't have a situation like they do in Russia and China, where you simply do not have the capacity to participate in discourse at the national level. And I'm saying that unless you have that, it's not really a proper democracy. So you see, one of my critiques of the Democrat campaign against Trump with Biden and with Kamala Harris, they failed to sufficiently well engage the nation in a national conversation. So they were coming in with a democratic deficit too, not just Trump. They weren't institution breakers. Their democratic deficit was that they were disengaged from the population. Trump's democratic deficit was it was an institution breaker and an erratic and sort of monstrously narcissistic one as well. But that kind of engagement is itself a part of democracy. But that too is going to be maximally impossible, precisely in the kind of society Dugin's talking about. So Dugin can't get, we're all in this together and we're engaging in discourse and conflict about where it is that we're going. That's a central part of democracy, a kind of telic part of democracy. And then there is the more banal part, which is institution breaking, and Dugin ignores both. Glenn comes back. He says, but surely the argument is important that even if you choose a strong leader with special powers, you still need ongoing democratic ratification. You see, that's way more challenge than Tucker would say, because Tucker would hear from Dugin, yeah, we've got to have totalitarian democracy here. And Tucker would say, amazing. So Glenn challenges a bit more. So here is Dugin's amazing answer. Don't you need ongoing democratic ratification? And Dugin says, look, if the AfD are in power in Germany, if Le Pen is in power in France, if Trump is in power in the USA, wouldn't you think they would recognize Russian elections as they currently are as free elections? Glenn, but you need alternatives. Dugin, why do we need alternatives if we're happy with somebody who is a father of the nation? And they're going to return to this issue of authoritarianism in a moment, but now the Ukraine detour. Glenn Greenwald asks, why is Ukraine escaping Russia's sphere of influence a threat to Russia? Dugin says, if you're a great power, only other great powers are sovereign for you. And then Glenn says, I suppose it's like China instilling anti-American sentiment in Mexico. Dugin says, when you see other powers doing this, then you'll understand. Putin's problem was he was too slow to intervene, and he acknowledged that. Glenn now asks Dugin, are you back in good standing in Russia? This is where we get to one of the most interesting parts of the conversation, which is what we put in the title. Dugin says, I'll critique Putin, if need be. And Dugin says, after the special military operation, I was called back. But if tomorrow conditions change and there are conditions of peace I find to be unacceptable, I would say that publicly, no matter the consequences. And then Dugin comes up, I apologize, I had my alarm going. Dugin comes up with one of his aphorisms, and he says, an anti-authoritarian in an authoritarian society can be crushed, but so can an illiberal in a liberal society. Dugin goes on. In response to Glenn's question about it sounding like for Dugin keeping Crimea and the Donbass isn't enough, Dugin says it would be a mistake. Putin may agree to this, but at grassroots it won't be accepted. They've promised us victory and demanded from us to fight until victory and to sacrifice for victory. To take this small part of Ukraine after so many sacrifices would not be victory in the eyes of the deep people. Maybe elites would glorify this, but not real society. The state is a living being. If the head rules, it doesn't mean other parts of the body can't participate. Now, Dugin then goes on to talk about the authoritarian wave. We have the same threat of loss of identity and cancellation of cultures and diminution of values and traditions that are being replaced by globalist postmodernist relativism. We have this all over the world. All identities are just a game and there are no real traditions. And that's why conservatives are coordinating across the globe. The way I really see my sort of perfect world, Dugin says, is not in terms of clans or nations or ethnic groups. I think there are simply different civilizations. And there's a pluralism of civilizations. China is a good example of a civilization state. Russia too. The USA actually too. Europe as well. There's Indian and Islamic civilization. It's the highest unity possible. There is no hierarchy between civilizations either. But we could conceivably actually arrive at something higher. And that's if we draw from all civilizations and bring things together including bringing all the great texts together. And notice how much Dugin is interested in talking about texts more than reality. Only after taking in consideration of all civilizational claims could we then arrive at a system that will allow us to have a picture of human rights. But today human rights are a liberal construct, even though what is human and what are rights is different in each civilization. Dugin goes on. The liberal globalists aren't a civilization unto themselves. They're just a segment, and a decaying segment of Western civilization. It's a temporary, sort of deformed instantiation of the West. And Dugin basically suggests that civilizations are incommensurable, that people inside, that concepts inside civilizations are incommensurable. That's to say that, in his words, not just political, ethical, and religious concepts are incommensurable, but concepts of what time and space is are incommensurable. By incommensurable, Dugin really means that when you take the key features of any civilization and compare it to the key features of another civilization, there isn't going to be a common currency of comparison according to which you could at a general level say that these features are either in one case better than the others, or worse than the others, or equal to the others. They're neither better nor worse nor equal. They're sufficiently different that it's a kind of a conceptual error to make comparison across the board. Now, it's easier to argue this with ethical concepts and political concepts, even though implausible up to a point too. But Dugin argues this for concepts of time and space, which really implies a kind of separateness, a kind of absence of human nature, of universal features of human life, of universal features of human psychology, that actually, if that's properly elaborated, it would then debar Dugin from making any of the observations about the world he makes, because they would themselves too be generalizations made from within a civilization. And Dugin, interestingly, would not necessarily resist that point that strongly. He'd be open to that relativism, I think. Now, here is the great humiliation for Dugin, even though, of course, he is very illuminating to us when we think about this authoritarian wave. Dugin is treating Russia as, and these are two mistakes he makes. He treats Russia as a separate civilization from the West. Now, sometimes he just goes and does that because he thinks the West is now in a decay and is lost touch with itself. But sometimes he does that just because he thinks Russia is a separate civilization. And the problem is that all Russian high art and high culture is Western. It's just not Russian. It's Western. And that's a problem because, Russian literature, Russian music are just branches on a tree called Western literature and Western music. That's one of the problems, funnily enough, with sort of picking up problematic bits of 19th century Russian texts and saying, oh, they're imperialist. Well, there's no distinction there of any substance between Western texts and Russian texts. They're engaged in the same tradition. It's the first thing. Secondly, that's not how you understand art production anyway. So that's one very big mistake of Dugin's, right? He's trying to argue that something isn't Western, that in respect of its high culture is entirely and exclusively Western. But the second thing he's arguing is that a sense of Russia's civilizational mission can be developed over time, even though it currently has no content. So, Mr. Dugin, who's going to develop it? And Dugin thinks that almost an application of willpower from sort of 5 or 7 key intellectuals like him can generate an alternative cultural picture for Russia that doesn't yet exist. So notice, it's not that Dugin thinks Putin is Russia. Putin is part of the old toxicity that Russia needs to leave behind. But he is just the most acceptable bridge Russia could have got from the old toxicity to true civilizational authenticity. Putin is part of the old order that must be destroyed. And he hopes that Putin will have a sort of a self-destructive function in that sense, that he will clear the path for things very different to him, and then act as a bridge between what came before and what comes after. But Dugin's problem is that that is not how ideas arise. Ideas arise spontaneously. Ideas arise when there is space for them to arise in the culture. And the kind of politics he currently supports for transitional reasons in Russia is simply incompatible, right, with the generation of the kind of culture of ideas he wishes for. Moreover, if you did create that space, that culture of ideas would drift far more toward the West than Dugin could possibly allow. So the problem is that the very thing that Dugin needs requires a degree of elbow room that Russia doesn't currently have, and a degree of cultural health that Russia currently doesn't have. You could have an authoritarian society with a big underground culture too. But then he also thinks that not only can you get there without a culture being in a healthy place to talk to itself about itself, but that you can generate the kind of ideas that he exactly wants rather than the kind of ideas that spontaneously arise. So it's an elementary misunderstanding of the relations of practice to reflection on practice. Reflection on practice and practice have an organic connection and a multi-causal connection. So what happens is that a certain cultural context arises in which an idea comes into being. You could imagine any idea, the idea of private property, or the idea of individual freedom in the West. That idea only arises because there is a cultural context for it. The instantiations of that idea arising that are particularly remarkable then feed back into the culture and cause change in the culture, which then creates new conditions for new ideas to arise. So it's a multi-directional and quite organic enterprise. Whereas what Dugin thinks is shut all of these Russians up and then 7 Dugins pen something and then it spreads. It doesn't work like that. It's an elementary misunderstanding by an intellectual about what relation intellectual work has to human life, which is humiliating. But unfortunately, Dugin is going to be more and more prescient when it comes to talking to us about the authoritarian wave globally that we're riding. If you survived this, thank you. Lots of love.